There is another reality, and notice I'm talking about emotions here. Pride in independence, regret with what Armenia actually is, and tremendous fear for its future. In other words, diaspora Armenians are for Armenia. The same way New York Jews are for Israel, but they aren't going to go live there. Right? In fact, Israelis leave Israel and go live in the United States. But they identify with that Armenia, and they're fearful of it for its future. And so diaspora Armenians very often, and not only the Dashnags, but even more moderate groups, take a far stronger position on certain nationalist issues than do Armenians native to Hayastan, to Armenia itself. They will be far more opposed to the protocols that the Armenian government signed with the Turkish government. They will be far more opposed to any slighting of the idea that there should be active campaigns for the recognition of the genocide in 1915. They are far less compromising or willing to compromise on any solution to the war with Azerbaijan over Karabakh. In many ways, the diaspora today constrains the Armenian government. It almost sees itself, at least the most active forces, like the Dashnag Suchun, as a potential second government that ought to be consulted and recognized. So when President Sarkisyan went to the United States to explain to American Armenians why they had signed the protocols, what it meant, what we hoped for, and so forth and so on, he was met with tremendous hostility and opposition. And in some ways that colored his view about what was possible and not possible. Now I should say that the power of the Armenian diaspora is incredibly overemphasized and exaggerated. There are groups that are very well organized, and they've divided groups opposed to each other. So you have the Armenian National Committee, which is the Dashnag Committee, and they have their own lobby, and they deal with Congress. There are other groups, the Armenian Assembly, which is the more moderate, kind of associated with the Ramgavar Liberal Democratic Party, and they have their lobby, and they have different aspirations. And I'm sure congressmen are very confused about who they're listening to at any one time. Armenians are also, I think, and I'm generalizing quite broadly here, but one does that in a short talk. Armenians are incredibly suspicious, yet another attitude, toward others still. Not only Turks, but Russians and Americans as well. There is a kind of sense that the history of Armenia has taught them to beware of foreigners and beware of betrayal, that we have been constantly betrayed. So these are dominant emotions that make up what I've called the affective disposition of the Armenian diaspora. Now obviously it's divided and it's different between different social levels, between different communities in different parts of the world, between different political movements, but I would say there's a kind of dominant affective disposition that is an emotional environment, an emotional universe within which they share certain feelings and values. I've been emphasizing in much of my recent work the importance of emotions in looking at how people feel about things, particularly in politics, because it's how you feel about things that in fact generate often your political activity. Think of how well the Republican Party in the United States has done by creating fear, anxiety about what Obama is, who he is he a Muslim, is he an American, whatever, is he going to create death panels through healthcare legislation? Those creations and manipulation of fear, very powerful emotion, anxiety about the future, has led to a surge in the popularity of a quite fringe populist movement, the so-called Tea Party movement. Now, these dominant emotions are even more long-lasting than kind of rational calculations of what might be best for Armenia or for the diaspora. When I was in Armenia over Christmas and New Year's, I met many people who were very for the protocols. They were worried about some of the implications. What would this commission on history be about? Is there need really to investigate an official histories of the genocide? Is there going to be a compromise on Karabakh? There were suspicions of that. And yet, the positive feeling was, first of all, we'll open our frontiers. We'll have normal relations with our largest neighbor. Trade can develop between, and the country which is poor and troubled economically can begin to develop. Yerevan, after all, is the largest city in that part of the world, if you consider that northeastern part of present-day Turkey. So there was much enthusiasm, but again, these dominant emotions color things. In some ways, I think the figure of Vartan Mamikonian captures many of these emotions. Now, you in this room may not know who Vartan Mamikonian was, but every Armenian knows. Vartan was a Naharar, a prince, a nobleman of an important Armenian family, who in the 5th century, 451, fought a brave battle against the Persians, who wanted to convert the Armenians to Mazdaism and end Christianity. We today mark this battle and commemorate this battle and consider Vartan to be a great national hero. His picture is in all the churches and in the classrooms. And he lost the battle and was killed, along with most of his people. Like the Serbs, their battle was in, I think, the 14th century or something. Ours goes back to the 5th century. We still commemorate this event because it was a moral victory. Armenia preserved its Christianity. Now, if you think about this figure, this emblematic warrior fighting to preserve Armenianness, whether it was in those days Christianity and today the nation, and of course he's now a national hero. He's been reconstructed. It was all about Christianity and salvation, but now it's about the nation. He was a martyr who sacrificed himself as well as many of his followers, but he was also a loser. He was not victorious. We don't have that many victories. We do mark our victories. We had one victory against the Turkish army in 1918 at Sardarabad, and we have lovely monuments with big, strong, serious eagles staring at Turkey. The Soviets made us turn the eagles around and they stare the other direction because that was too antagonistic. Basically, Armenians are, if they are unified, and we are a very, very fragmented nation, we are unified by the symbolic importance of the events of 1915, the genocide. The genocide, after all, whether you think it's a genocide or not, the massacres, deportations, was effectively a deracination, an uprooting of the nation, of a people who had lived on this territory since at least the 5th, 6th century BC, when the first accounts of Armenia are mentioned on Persian inscriptions. It was an experience of dispersion, of dissemination, destruction of the intelligentsia. That's why we mark April 14th, the date that the Young Turks rounded up the intellectuals of Istanbul. It confirms our ideas of victimhood and isolation, of betrayal, of perpetual danger. There's a wonderful quote from the Czech writer Milan Kundera. I quote, "A small nation can disappear and knows it." Unquote. Small nation can disappear and knows it. Armenians are that kind of small nation that realizes it almost disappeared and it can still disappear, and that anxiety lives with them as part of their affective disposition. Now, I learned here in Turkey from some of my friends that Turks themselves see themselves often as victims, as betrayed, as isolated, and in danger of extinction. A great big nation like this. Well, I'm reminded of my dear friends and my beloved Russia, which I studied for 50 years. Russians also lost an empire and had this kind of post-imperial syndrome that it could happen to us. And though Russia is a nation of 200 million people, though they're having a demographic decline, in their discourse, in their talking, in their language, in Putin's speeches, this idea of decline, of possible, not extinction exactly, but of irrelevance in the world, of colossal humiliation at the hands of America, NATO, and Europe, is a persistent theme. So it's very interesting that nations, large and small, have these ideas. Finally, let me say this one thing, which occurred to me only recently, and which I've mentioned in other talks, but which I think in some ways is a good way to end a talk about the Armenian diaspora, particularly at this university, at Sabancı, and in Istanbul. The genocide has become a serious subject for investigation and academic research in the last 15 years, in a way that it wasn't before. And Turkish and Armenian scholars, as well as European scholars and American scholars, have come together. Fikret Adanir is one of them, Halil Berktay another. People have come together in a collective group. We organized in Michigan and Chicago, and here at the Bilgi conference in 2005, etc., to talk about these events. And they have had extraordinary effects among Armenians and among Turks. I think, in general, positive effects, but different effects. Among Turks, the project of investigating the genocide is a project, you could call it, of the left. Not only leftists themselves, but a left project in the sense that it is a deconstructive project of questioning the dominant nationalist narratives with which people live and which many accept without question. So it is a subversive discussion. It undermines unquestioned assumptions, forces people to think about the world in a new way. In that way, it's emancipatory, it's liberating. It opens up the world, opens up Turkish imagination to their multiculturalism, to human rights issues, to European values, to understanding their place in the world in a different way from a kind of isolation of betrayal, victimhood, etc. Regrettably, and again, I would hesitate to say this before an Armenian audience, but I have done exactly that on April 24th. Regrettably for Armenians, for many Armenians, the study of the genocide does not undermine their nationalist self-conception, but confirms it. We look at the genocide, and then we say, yes, we're victims. We're betrayed. We ought to pull in ourselves, isolate ourselves, because the world should be suspected. They are odarner, they are possibly our enemies. And that discourse is particularly powerful in Armenia itself, which has become quite isolated. It is, after all, an isolated country. It's a country which is fighting wars with its neighbors, etc. And it's also powerful among a large part of the diaspora, particularly among the more nationalist elements. So what we're trying to do through this dialogue with Turkish scholars and other scholars is try to open up the imaginary of